Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take that stack of sources you send us, articles, reports, all sorts of things, and, well, we dive deep. We look for the key insights, the surprising connections, basically trying to cut through the noise for you. So for this deep dive, we're unpacking a whole collection of recent reports. They're centered around government actions, economic signs, and some real challenges hitting established institutions. It's all straight from the material you provided.
And it's quite a mix, isn't it? We've got sources touching on, international travel policy, trade tensions, but also the nitty-gritty of how the U.S. government collects its economic data. Plus, these pretty significant legal and institutional challenges for universities, even parts of the justice system. The idea is to connect these dots, figure out what really matters and why it matters.
Exactly. It ranges from travel bans to trade fights, data collection methods, to university accreditation battles. It's a lot, but we'll sort through it. Okay, let's get started. First up, let's talk about a policy that really defined the first Trump administration, the travel ban. The sources say there's a new version, Travel Ban V2.0, announced just yesterday.
That's right. And this one's pretty wide-reaching. It completely bans citizens from 12 countries, and then there are partial bans for 7 others.
Do the sources list the countries?
They do. The full ban list includes Afghanistan, Chad, Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Myanmar, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, and the partial list: Burundi, Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Togo, Turkmenistan, and Venezuela.
Okay, so how does this version V2.0 stack up against the original one, the one that got tied up in courts for so long?
Well, you'll remember V1.0 faced a ton of legal challenges. Eventually, the Supreme Court upheld it 5-4. They cited national security, basically giving the president pretty broad powers in that area. Then, of course, Joe Biden lifted those restrictions back in 2021.
And this new ban, the sources suggest there was maybe more groundwork laid this time.
Yeah, the observation in the source material is that the State Department seems to have done more, let's call it homework, possibly to help it survive court challenges better this time. The source uses this phrase describing the targeted nations as, quote, full of Muslims, but not full of oil, a threat to the United States.
And the timing. The sources linked it to a recent attack.
They do, specifically an attack mentioned in Colorado. And there's a quote attributed to Trump connecting the ban to preventing major foreign terror attacks on American soil, similar to his first term. The source points out he didn't name a specific attack, but right-wing media apparently drew the lines pretty quickly.
So what's the simplest read on this, according to the sources? What's the real driver here?
Well, the Occam's razor explanation offered is that it's basically political theater. It's designed to show the base that the administration is cracking down on, quote, dangerous foreigners. And, the source suggests, it might also serve to distract from trickier issues like lack of progress at the border or fights over the budget.
Right. And this kind of executive action targeting countries, it connects to other things too, like trade tensions. Your sources mention China tariffs.
Absolutely. Trump's arguments for tariffs usually boil down to 2 things: bringing jobs back and making deals, getting wins. There's a quote the source highlights from his social media. I like President yelling of China, but he's very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with.
And the source reads that as him focusing on the deal swings part.
That's the interpretation, yeah, that he's really angling for a negotiation win right now.
How do the sources paint Xi Jinping's position in all this?
They describe him as, well, a Chinese patriot and definitely not stupid. The thinking is he knows Trump wants a quick, headline-grabbing win, and since Xi doesn't face elections like Trump does, he can afford to wait. The source suggests he knows Trump might get more desperate and eventually settle for less, for crumbs, as the source puts it.
Okay, there was that deal mentioned, May 12th in Switzerland, 90-day tariff suspension, but now they're accusing each other of breaking it.
Exactly. And a really interesting piece of that puzzle, according to the source, involves rare earth materials. Trump apparently expected Xi to ease up on export restrictions for these critical minerals. That hasn't happened.
Was that actually in the deal or just something Trump hoped for?
The source says it's unclear. It might have been part of the formal agreement, or maybe Xi just said he'd consider it. But these rare earths are vital, right? They go into tons of U.S. products. So the source speculates manufacturers might be leaning on Trump now.
And Trump keeps saying he wants to get Xi on the phone. The source thinks that's a bad idea.
Yeah, they call it really stupid, basically, for a few reasons. First, it signals desperation, gives Xi leverage. Second, there's the worry Trump might not be, fully briefed on complex stuff like rare earths, whereas Xi would have his experts prepping him. And third, Xi apparently prefers his experts to hammer out the details before he steps in.
So the source predicts if she does take the call.
The prediction is, in their words, he'll eat his lunch.
Yeah.
They use this moo-shu pork analogy, which apparently is like the Chinese version of getting taken to the cleaners in a negotiation.
Okay. Let's shift gears. Another big theme in the sources, the reliability of government information, starting with economic data.
Right. Your sources picked up on the Fed's Beige Book report from Wednesday. The key takeaways noted were that the U.S. economy actually contracted a bit over the last 6 weeks, hiring slowed down, and businesses and consumers are worried, specifically about tariff-related price increases.
What did it say about inflation overall?
It described prices rising at a moderate pace. But, and this is important, it also mentioned widespread reports of contacts expecting costs and prices to rise at a faster rate going forward. Some businesses are apparently already planning to pass on those tariff costs in about 3 months.
And it wasn't uniform across the country.
No, definitely regional differences. Boston, New York, Philadelphia reported slowing or declining activity. Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago saw better growth. The source specifically pulled out the mention of New York seeing heightened uncertainty and those tariff-induced cost increases.
Okay, now connect that to something else in the sources. There's a report about the Labor Department having trouble collecting this data.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
A report detailing cutbacks in how the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, collects inflation data for the Consumer Price Index, and the reasons cited directly in the source. The administration's government-wide hiring freeze.
What does that mean practically? Fewer samples.
Pretty much. The source says the BLS is reducing sample in areas across the country. And they've actually stopped collecting price data altogether in a few specific cities because of staffing shortages.
Which cities?
Lincoln, Nebraska, Provo, Utah, and Buffalo, New York. Just not enough people, the source says, due to the freeze.
Why should people care? I mean, how critical is this data?
Oh, it's incredibly critical. The source reminds us it's used for Social Security cost of living adjustments, for calculating interest on certain Treasury bonds, TPS. It even influences private sector wages. Economists quoted in the source are worried. They think these kinds of cuts could degrade the reliability and efficacy of agencies like BLS. And it's not just consumer prices. The source mentions BLS also stopped collecting wholesale prices for the Producer Price Index in about 350 categories.
What are the specific worries, especially given the timing with tariffs?
Well, one economist, Omer Sharif, is quoted saying it's worrying given that we're heading into the teeth of the tariff impact on prices.
Yeah.
His point is that a smaller sample size means more potential error. It can make the indexes jump around more, become more volatile, and potentially less accurate.
But the BLS itself says the impact is minimal.
They do say the overall impact is minimal, according to the source, but they also admit it may increase the volatility of specific items. And the source provides context. Trump froze hiring on day one, extended it, so future reports will likely have less data too. Plus, the administration apparently got rid of advisory committees that used to work with these statistical agencies.
There's also a quote from a former BLS commissioner, Erica Grosjean.
Yes. She estimates the agency lost about 15% of its staff, cites low morale, and what she calls attacks on government workers. And she warns it's not just the big numbers people see. It threatens less visible but still important data, like import prices or job opening stats.
Okay, so we have concerns about data collection, but the sources also talk about potential censorship of reports.
That's right, a report claiming Trump officials are censoring government reports that Donald Trump might not like. The source kind of shrugs, calls it dog bites, man.
Yeah.
News, maybe not surprising, but points out it was still Politico's lead story.
Is there a specific example?
Yes, a routine agricultural trade report. It forecast the trade deficit would increase. That's something Trump dislikes, right? He claims tariffs reduce deficits. So according to the source, officials just killed the forecast, removed it from the report.
And what's the source's take on what this signals?
They see it as part of a pattern, viewing truth as basically what he wants to hear and what advances his personal goals. This raises what the source calls the unpleasant but likely possibility that any fact-based report that doesn't align with his narrative might get squashed or edited to fit.
What are the potential downstream effects if people stop trusting government reports?
Big problems, potentially. Loss of public trust, obviously. The source quotes a former USDA chief economist, Joe Glauber, saying, "Objectivity is really key here. To lose that trust would be terrible." It could also lead to chaos in industries that depend on accurate data, like farmers making planting decisions or buyers setting prices. The worst-case scenario sketched out is nobody takes government stats seriously anymore, causing huge uncertainty and unnecessary economic harm.
Right, the source even mentioned that movie, Trading Places, as an analogy for bad decisions based on bad USDA reports.
Exactly, that kind of ripple effect.
Okay, let's pivot again. The sources also show the administration challenging other established institutions, specifically universities and parts of the Justice Department.
Yeah, your sources focus on actions against Harvard and Columbia, calling it a crusade.
Start with Harvard. What's happening there?
Well, the administration announced it's canceling Harvard's approval for international students. They're citing presidential powers for national security. The source describes the order itself as rambling and only semi-coherent. It apparently accuses Harvard of hiding info on criminal foreign students, threatens existing visas, and it even veers into affirmative action, accusing Harvard of discriminating against non-favored races.
Isn't this the second time they've gone after Harvard's international students?
It is. The source points out the first attempt by Homeland Security is actually still stuck in court under a temporary restraining order. So the expectation is this new attempt will also end up in court, and the source doesn't seem to rate the White House's chances very highly.
Okay, what about Columbia? The issue there is accreditation.
Yes, the administration is trying to get Columbia's accreditation revoked. The stated reason, according to the source, is that Columbia allegedly hasn't done enough about anti-Semitism or protecting Jewish students since the Gaza war started. They're invoking the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The source called the accreditation process very weedy. Why is it so complicated?
Well, basically, the government can influence things like student aid eligibility, but it doesn't directly control accreditation. That's done by private, nonprofit agencies. In Columbia's case, it's the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, or MSCHE.
So this threat against Columbia, what does it actually amount to, practically speaking?
According to the source, it really boils down to a letter from the Secretary of Education asking MSCHE to consider revoking accreditation. And the MSCE spokesperson apparently described the request as just a press release. The source calls that pretty serious shade in academic circles.
Okay, and the likely outcome here, how long might this take?
The source calls the administration's argument laughable. They think MSCHE isn't likely to jump on this. Even if they did investigate, the source estimates it would take years before anything happened, maybe a decade before Columbia was in real peril. That's long after January 2029. Plus, you'd expect lawsuits to drag it out even further.
Why does Columbia have to fight this so hard, though?
Because losing accreditation is existential. The source says non-accredited degrees are basically worthless. Losing billions is bad. But losing accreditation means the university, for all practical purposes, ceases to exist. So they have no choice but to fight it, tooth and nail.
And the source drew a broader lesson from Columbia's experience.
Yeah, they point out Columbia was reportedly trying to play ball, kowtowing to Trump and trying to do his bidding, as the source puts it, and their reward, having their entire existence threatened. The lesson, the source suggests, for universities and maybe law firms too, is you can never give Trump enough. They use that inch-mile analogy, escalating to light years and parsecs, like the Kessel Run. You can never satisfy the demand.
There was also that Thomas Edsall piece cited, giving some context to this whole university thing.
Right. Edsall argues that while the fight is nominally about anti-Semitism, it's in reality clearly about something else. His take is that Trump just hates higher education and to-dos, especially the elite institutions, and wants to make an example of some.
The source even had that quote from a cabinet meeting. Trump justifying cutting Harvard grants because they're not American.
Yeah, because its students, professors, its whole attitude is not American, and they don't swallow his BS whole, according to the source's account of the quote.
And potential influences like J.D. Vance.
The source mentions Vance, a Yale law grad, calling universities fundamentally corrupt and saying people need to attack the universities. He apparently ended a speech quoting Nixon. The press is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The source interprets that pretty broadly. Anyone critical is the enemy.
Wow. And Secretary McMahon saying research is okay as long as it's in sync with administration goals.
Yes, the source reads that as basically saying if your research shows we're wrong, you shouldn't do it. The example given was vaccine research potentially conflicting with a party line.
But the sources also acknowledge bias within universities, right? It's not one-sided.
No, they do touch on that. The general observation is universities might tolerate left-leaning speech more readily than right-leaning speech. Welcoming speakers they agree with, while others face protests. They use the old example of Professor Arthur Jensen's controversial IQ research at Berkeley. The source notes the general freakout, versus maybe focusing on methodology, and speculates if his results had been different, he might have been praised. Again, the source stresses this isn't endorsing Jensen, just illustrating a perceived general bent.
So the source's bottom line on this university crusade
Is that Trump sees elite universities as liberal strongholds that need to be essentially torn down and rebuilt on conservative lines, which the source notes is just swapping one bias for another, and the prosperity that comes from the research at these places, apparently not a factor for him.
There was that point about irony from Professor Sean Westwood, too.
Right. Westwood points out the contradiction. Wanting to kill DEI programs for considering factors besides merit, while also openly calling to hire more conservative professors, which is hiring based on a non-merit factor political viewpoint.
And the Wall Street Journal piece detailed specific actions against Harvard?
Yeah, frozen grants, threats to tax status, trying to dictate curriculum and hiring. The Journal piece, as cited, suggests that the government seems bent on destroying the school for the offense of fighting back. So, summing up the source's view, Trump is trying to neutralize opposition. Media, law firms may be already pressured. Universities are next on the list. The stated reasons, anti-Semitism or whatever, are seen as excuses. The real goal is to crush all opposition, and Harvard's a big target. But the source does add maybe he's bitten off more than he can chew this time.
Okay, let's shift slightly again. Challenges to the justice system itself. Your sources talk about former DOJ lawyers forming a group.
That's right. A new group led by Stacey Young, made up of former DOJ lawyers. Their goal is specifically to help people targeted by Trump.
Why did they feel this was necessary?
The source explains the concern is that with the administration attacking law firms, the big established firms might shy away from representing people Trump targets, especially in complex cases. This could leave those people with no recourse at all, potentially leading to, as the source puts it, no justice at all soon.
Who are these volunteer lawyers?
They all used to work at the Department of Justice, so they have deep experience, which the source thinks will give targets confidence in them.
There was a quote from one volunteer, Melanie Proctor.
Yes, she talked about her pride in the DOJ oath out. The law was the law. And her fear now that people will be targeted for doing the right thing, not for breaking the law, but for upholding it against the administration's wishes.
And they're particularly concerned about one group of DOJ attorneys.
Yes, those who prosecuted January 6 cases. Trump has reportedly promised to fire them. They'll likely need lawyers to fight those dismissals.
But there's a problem with where they'd fight those dismissals.
A huge problem. The usual place, the Merit Systems Protections Board, MSPB, isn't functioning. The administration fired the chair, Kathy Harris, so it lacks a quorum enough members to actually make decisions. The Supreme Court apparently didn't reinstate her while her case goes on. This spells trouble for anyone fired, the source says. They can't appeal through the normal channel, and it could last for a while.
Another former DOJ person, David Loftman, who worked on the Russia probe, was quoted too.
Yes, Loftman called the DOJ a cornerstone of the rule of law and said the administration took a sledgehammer to that.
Right.
He feels a moral obligation to help colleagues whose careers are threatened for just doing their jobs without fear or favor.
Okay, let's look at a couple of specific legal battles mentioned in the sources. First, this election case Trump apparently won.
Right. This relates to an executive order from early in his term. It basically says federal agencies must follow the Attorney General's legal opinions and can't contradict the AG or the president.
And Democrats were worried about how that might play out in elections.
Their concern, according to the source, was that a future AG could issue an opinion favoring Republicans, and the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, would be legally required to follow it. So they sued.
And the result?
On Tuesday, Judge Amir Ali, a Biden appointee, tossed the lawsuit out.
On what grounds?
The source says it was no standing to sue. Basically, the Democrats couldn't show they had already been harmed by the executive order. You generally need to show actual concrete damage to sue the government, and the judge wasn't convinced that it happened yet.
Even though they argued they were already changing their behavior because of it?
Apparently not convincing enough. The source indicates the judge wanted a concrete example of damage the order had already done, not just anticipated future harm.
But he left the door open for them to come back.
Yes, the source notes the judge said if circumstances change and they can show actual damages from the order, they're welcome to refile the case.
Okay, second case. The birthright citizenship case appeal. This came from an executive order on day one of Trump v. 2.0.
Yes, that's the order trying to limit automatic citizenship only to babies born in the U.S. if at least one parent is a citizen.
Trump lost the first round.
He did. Judge John Kaufner ruled the order violated the Constitution.
So yesterday was the appeal hearing in the Ninth Circuit. What were the administration's arguments per the source?
The DOJ lawyer, Eric MacArthur, argued a few things. That a literal reading of the Constitution encourages birth tourism. That the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause only applies to women domiciled here. And that the original debate around the amendment only intended to cover newly freed slaves.
How did the judges react?
The source describes two judges, both Clinton appointees, as pretty skeptical. Judge Ronald Gould apparently questioned the textual basis for the domiciled argument, saying, "I don't see any language in there textually that says." Why? And Judge Michael Hawkins reportedly said relying on congressional debate would get scorn from a textualist like Justice Scalia. The source thinks MacArthur probably won't get their votes.
But there was a third judge.
Judge Patrick Dumite, a Trump appointee, he was not as skeptical, according to the source.
What was his focus?
He apparently brought up the old 1898 Supreme Court case, Wong Kim Ark. That case affirmed birthright citizenship even if parents weren't citizens. Bumate supposedly suggested the legality of the parents' presence was somehow key, even though the source adds that nothing in the decision suggested that.
So the outlook at this appeal level, based on the source.
Doesn't look great for Trump with two skeptical judges on the three-judge panel, but the source adds, if Bumate does vote to uphold the order, his reasoning might be something the Supreme Court could latch onto if it ever gets there.
Okay, just a couple more quick political items from the sources to round things out. The Virginia special election.
Yes, for the late Jerry Connolly seat, Governor Glenn Youngkin set the date for September 9th.
And the source noted something about that date choice.
Yeah, they observed Youngkin didn't play political games with the timing, unlike, say, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who reportedly scheduled another special election way out in November. The speculation in the sources, maybe Youngkin, eyeing a 2028 presidential run, wants to keep a moderate lane open, avoid looking very partisan, especially if Trump's numbers aren't great.
Interesting. Okay, finally, international news. The Dutch government collapsed.
Yeah, kind of surprising news this week. The source described it as a coalition of 4 very different parties that just couldn't hold it together despite months of trying.
And Geert Wilders' party, PVV, is key here.
His party won the most seats last time, but forming a government was tough because others didn't want to work with him. They finally got a technocrat PM, Dick Scoof, but the source says Wilders still runs the show from Parliament.
His main issue being immigration.
Absolutely. Stopping immigration by any means is how the source puts it. They mention his support for things like banning the Quran, closing mosques. The source notes, he doesn't like Muslims much. We've heard that before somewhere.
What caused the final break, according to the source?
Wilders apparently got fed up with the other parties stalling about banning asylum seekers. He gave them a list of demands, told them to sign as is. They refused, he pulled out, and boom, new elections, probably in October.
What are the underlying tensions the source points to? Costs.
Yeah, costs for housing, healthcare, education for immigrants. Plus, this clashes with the EU pushing members to spend way more on defense. That means social spending might need cuts, and Wilders doesn't want that money going to foreigners.
And this isn't just a Dutch thing.
No, the source places it in a wider European context. Says it's hard to find a country where the people want more immigrants, pointing to the AfD party getting 21% in Germany as another example.
And the timing is a bit awkward.
Just slightly embarrassing, yeah. NATO leaders are meeting in The Hague soon, and the head of NATO now is Mark Rutte, the former Dutch PM whose government just fell.
Huh. And there was something about the limits on the current caretaker government.
All right, they're technically only supposed to carry out existing policy. The source finds that impractical, like, what if Ukraine urgently needs help? Can they really just muddle along?
And we have to mention that quirky anecdote from the source about their own consulting experience in Dutch elections.
Oh, yeah, the story about lawyers not getting open source software and counting votes on those enormous paper ballots by hand. A little window into how things actually work sometimes.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground today, all pulled from those sources you shared. We went from travel bans and trade spats to serious questions about university futures, the justice system, even the reliability of basic government data.
Yeah, and when you put it all together like this, you really see patterns emerging, don't you? Significant shifts, major challenges across different sectors, often driven by pretty specific political goals, leading to these really complex legal and economic ripple effects.
Exactly. So you've just navigated all that with us. You can see how an action here, like tariffs, might connect over there to economic reports, or how a legal fight here shapes how policies are enforced over there, or who can even access legal help.
Right. And maybe the final thought to leave you with, connecting all this, is when these core institutions, we rely on universities for knowledge, agencies for data, the courts for justice, when they face the kind of pressure or disruption described in these sources, how does that change things? How does it change how we understand what's happening? How reliable are the usual sources? Can you still seek redress through normal channels? It really raises a fundamental question. How do you navigate a landscape where the very systems designed to inform us and uphold norms seem to be under so much strain? Something to chew on until our next deep dive.